milk goat or milk cow? That is today's question. I'm Kelsey from roughandtumblefarmhouse.com, and today I'm going to talk to you about the pros and cons of having a dairy goat or a dairy cow. Now, I have had dairy cows for about 7 years. I've had milk goats for just the last 3, so I'm by no means an expert, but I feel like I do know enough that I can help you determine whether or not you want a goat or a cow, or maybe like we have, you want both. So before we even start talking about the differences in these animals, I really want to emphasize one thing. Have you had goat's milk before? Do you like the taste? Because some people, they really like the idea of goats. They try goat's milk for the first time, they find they do not like the taste, and it's kind of pointless. So make sure you know if you like goat's milk or not before we even get into the other questions. And one thing I should say too is that these are kind of general blanket statements. There are always going to be exceptions to every single rule when it comes to animals. So let's start our discussion with dairy goats, like Sucre here behind me. Dairy goats are going to cost you a lot less to get started with. If you're not too particular about your breeding, you can get a decent dairy goat for around $300, at least that's what it is where I live, which is a lot cheaper than getting yourself a milk cow, which is probably going to cost you upwards of $1,000. Goats also are going to require a lot less space than dairy cows. We'll talk about that in a little bit. If you just have a small homestead with limited acreage, goats might be the ticket. Goats also can do well on wooded areas. Goats actually prefer to graze up. They're more so a browser than they are a grazer, so they really like to eat bushes, trees, shrubs, that sort of a thing, versus just being out on a pasture. So if you have more of a wooded area, goats again might be a good option for you. Another nice thing about goats is that their milk is different than cows. It tends to have different flavors that make it really great for making cheese. It also is good for value adding for making soap. So if you're thinking about doing some value adding for your business, goats again might be a good option. Goats obviously are also a lot smaller than cows, and so in terms of transporting them, you can just throw them in the back of your minivan, which I have done many a time to move a goat from A to B, and they're also smaller when it comes to handling them. If you're not used to being around larger animals like cows, it can be a little bit intimidating, versus a goat is a little easier to handle. I will say though that goats are a lot stronger than they look. Other positives of goats are that they are going to eat a lot less than a cow's going to eat. A goat eats around 4 to 7 pounds of hay a day depending on the goat. A cow is going to eat around 30 up to 60 pounds of hay depending on the size cow and the breed. Another positive about goats is that you're going to get less milk, which I know sounds kind of odd, but we'll talk about that more when we get to the dairy cow section. Goats will give you way less milk than a cow will, which can be much easier to manage just on more of a homestead or small farm type scale. Talk about some of the negatives of having dairy goats. First one, they tend to be a lot more fragile than cows are. I've had vets out for my goats on a yearly basis. I have not, hold on a second, let me find some wood here to knock on. Have not had to have the vets out for my cows, I don't think at all. Again, I'm really gonna just knock on that wood. But we have had goats that have died from bloat. We've had goats that died from wormer resistance. We've had goats that got tangled up in a feeder and then strangled, like all sorts of awful ways that goats have killed themselves. And I know we're not alone in this, but it's something you feel just terrible as a farmer when your goats don't make it. So people think, oh, I'll just get a goat, they're easy to take care of. Honestly, I think they are a lot more high maintenance and harder to keep healthy than a dairy cow is gonna be. Another negative about goats is they are the Houdinis of the animal world. If they can escape it, they will. I have seen them jump up and twist in the air to get through a hole. I have seen them climb fences. I have seen them drop on their bellies and army crawl underneath fences. They will get through things if at all they can. Another negative to dairy goats, which is also kind of a positive, is you're going to get less milk. And the milk also, I find, tends to vary a lot more in flavor. My Jersey milk pretty much stays mostly the same all the way through her lactation. Goat's milk, however, based on what she's eating, what time of her lactation she's in, the flavor really changes quite a bit. Another thing with goats is that if you're breeding them every single year, a lot of goats, it's pretty typical for them to have twins. So before you know it, your goat herd is going to grow exponentially and you're going to have a lot of goat babies. So either you need to be planning on eating them or selling them into a ready market, because before you know it, you're going to be inundated with goats. Another issue with goats as well is having to get them bred. I find it's much easier to have my cows AI than it is my goats. I don't even know anyone around here who does artificial insemination for goats, so we keep a buck here on our farm. Keeping a buck means that you have to have a separate space for your bucks so they're not just running with your does, getting them pregnant all sorts of random times of the year. You also need to then have a buddy for your buck. Otherwise your bucks get lonely and try and escape and hurt themselves, or sometimes they're just miserable because they're all by themselves, and goats are definitely herd animals. All right, we've talked goats, now let's talk cows. So cows in general, I find them to be much easier keepers. In terms of getting sick or having any sort of issues, my cows have been pretty easy. I mean, a little scrape here and there. I do keep stuff on hand for calving time in case you have issues with milk fever or anything like that, but for the most part, they've been really easy to have. I mean, can I please just make one video quick? Seriously, just let me shoot one video. Just one. You had your turn. Now we're talking about cows. So I know a lot of people who keep cows in just with a couple of strands of barbed wire or a single line of hot wire. Obviously, they're also incredibly sweet and cute, depending on your cow. I happen to have sweet cutie pies. But if an animal is gonna have escaped, typically it's my goats. And if my family at all is watching this, they're probably laughing because our cows did get out, because our fencing is something of a disaster area right now. Our cows did get out multiple times, and it's a real pain to get them home. Another great thing about dairy cows is the cream, especially with cows like Jerseys. You get a ton of delicious, thick cream you can use for making ice cream, for making cream cheese, just having a straight up cream, and of course butter, which you really don't get that with goat's milk. If you leave goat's milk long enough, it will separate out. You can also use a separator, but just still the amount of cream you get is nothing compared to what you get with cows. You also are gonna get a ton of milk with cows. We do milk sharing with our cows, which means that we let the calf nurse on the moms as long as we're milking them. And so from Juneberry here, who has been our primary milk cow, on her heavier days, she'll give us around 2 gallons. Otherwise, on average, it's about a gallon and a half a day, which is still more than enough for what we need for making cheese, selling to some customers, and just having for drinking and putting on cereal and all that good stuff. Another thing about dairy cows is that depending on where you live, it can be a lot easier to get them bred. If you live in an area where there are already several dairy farms, you can maybe talk to a local farmer who does their own AI, or there's probably an AI tech, which means an artificial insemination tech in your area, and you can just get on their route and they can come by and take care of breeding for you, so you don't have to have bulls around. Cows also produce a lot of manure, which is great. You can pile it up, and we've got a huge compost pile over there. We just keep turning it every year, and every few years we have really great compost for raised beds, gardens, you name it. So let's talk some negatives about dairy cows. If you have cows, you're gonna need a lot more pasture than what you need for goats. A cow needs a minimum 1 acre of really solid pasture to eat. When I say solid, I'm talking like knee-high or higher, really solid forage, a good mix of grasses and legumes. Otherwise, you're gonna have to supplement with hay. Another negative about cows is transportation. If you've got a goat, like I said before, you can throw them in the back of your car. A cow, you absolutely are gonna have to have a trailer. Another negative about cows that is also positive is their manure. Cows make a lot of manure. On our farm, the biggest machinery we have is probably our pickup. And in terms of moving stuff around, we have a wheelbarrow and a pitchfork and some shovels. So when it comes time to cleaning out the loafing shed where they hang out all winter, we actually have to hire out a skid steer guy to come and clean it out, because there's just no way to stay on top of that amount of manure with a wheelbarrow and some forks. Cows also produce a ton of milk, which is a benefit, but it also can be a little bit of a burden at first. When that milk starts coming in and filling the fridge, you are so excited to have it. And then within about 3 days, your refrigerator is full, your top shelf is shaking under the weight of 60 plus pounds of cow's milk. So you have to have something to do with it, whether it is customers making cheese. There are goats right now chewing on the bottom of my camera tripod. Goats are also nibblers more than cows are. You gotta see these guys. Another negative to consider when it comes to having cows is the cost of hay and getting hay to your farm. Our Jerseys, they eat between 30 and 40 pounds of hay a day. That is a lot of hay when you do the math. We go through thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of hay, especially here in Minnesota where we have to feed hay a lot. If you're somewhere where you've got warmer temperatures, it might not be that bad, but we have to feed hay about 8 out of 12 months of the year here. So what is the verdict? Dairy goats or dairy cows? Really, it's gonna depend on you, your farm and your homestead, and also what sort of animal you like. So before you go out and buy a milk cow or whole herd of dairy goats, I highly recommend that you spend some time with the actual animal, making sure that you like them, because you might get your goats and decide that they are just too wily, you don't like their personalities. You might get a cow and decide they're too big and you just can't believe how much milk you're gonna have. So it's a really good idea, if you can, to find some farmers or homesteaders who are fine with you coming and hanging out for a few Saturdays during milking time and just to help with chores, so you can get a feel for the actual animal, because that'll go a long way in telling you what is right for your homestead. Let me know in the comments if I missed any important, oh my gosh, you goats, if I missed any important pros or cons for cows or goats. You can always find more cow and goat content over on our blog. We have 2 new posts every single week, and we have a new video here on the YouTube channel about farming, family, food, and fortitude here at our Rough and Tumble farmhouse.